Girl sells artwork to fund her chemo. Then Clint Eastwood walks by and shocks everyone. When Clint Eastwood walked past a busy art stand on a city sidewalk, most people didn't even notice him. Just another face in the crowd, just another passerby. But when he stopped, picked up a painting and quietly listened to the girl in front of the stand, everything changed. Because this wasn't just any artist. Sophie Carter wasn't painting for fame. She was painting to save her life. And what happened next? That moment became unforgettable. In classic Clint Eastwood fashion, he didn't just buy a painting, he changed her future forever. It was a sterile, dimly lit room, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly, casting a pale glow over the white walls. The sharp scent of antiseptic hung in the air, mingling with the faint beep of monitors from the next room. Sophie sat on the crinkled hospital bed, hands balled into tight fists in her lap. Dr. Patel stood across from her, adjusting his glasses, his face carefully neutral. Sophie already knew what was coming. She'd heard that tone before, the one doctors use when they're about to deliver bad news. "The treatment is working," he said, a tiny spark of hope in his voice. "But you'll need at least 2 more rounds of chemo." Sophie barely flinched. She was used to the routine, the pain, the exhaustion, the sickness. It had become part of her life. What she wasn't used to was what he said next. "I understand your family is struggling with the costs," he began, pausing. "Without insurance coverage for the next round, the out-of-pocket expenses will be..." He hesitated, then sighed. "Substantial." Her mother let out a shaky breath beside her. Sophie didn't need to look at her to know her mother was fighting back tears. The medical bills had already drained them dry. Their savings were gone, and the last round of treatments had pushed them to the edge. Now this. For the first time in a long while, fear crept into Sophie's chest. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of watching her parents lose everything trying to save her. The drive home was quiet. Her mother gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Her father's voice had been hoarse when he told her everything would be okay, but Sophie could hear the lie in it. That night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. She refused to be a burden. She couldn't let her parents drown in debt because of her. And that's when it hit her. Art. It had always been her escape, her passion. If she could create something that mattered, something people wanted to buy, maybe she could fight back in her own way. By morning, Sophie had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait for a miracle. She was going to make one. The first stroke of paint always felt like magic. The brush glided across the canvas, leaving behind soft blues and bold strokes of orange. The colors bled together to form something new, something alive. Sophie sat on a foldable stool, her art stand set up on a bustling downtown sidewalk. The small wooden table in front of her was covered with neatly arranged canvases, each one a piece of her soul. Her mother had helped her set up that morning, but the rest was all Sophie. She'd spent the last week pouring everything she had into her paintings, knowing this wasn't just about art anymore. It was about survival. If she could sell enough, if people saw the value in what she created, maybe, just maybe, she could afford the treatments that could save her life. But hope was a fragile thing. Pedestrians walked by, some glancing her way, others barely noticing. A woman in a navy blazer slowed for a second, admiring a canvas before shaking her head and walking off. Sophie's heart sank, but she kept painting, refusing to let the doubt creep in. A man in sunglasses and a tailored suit stopped long enough to read the small, handwritten sign in front of her booth. Original art. Funding my cancer treatment. His lips pressed into a tight line. Then he turned and walked away. Sophie exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on her, making her dizzy. Hours had passed, and not a single piece had sold. She reached for her water bottle, her hands trembling slightly as she took a sip. Fatigue weighed on her bones, a cruel reminder of what she was up against, not just the world but her own body. But giving up wasn't an option. She forced a smile as an elderly couple approached. "These are beautiful," the woman murmured, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of a canvas. It was a piece Sophie had poured her heart into. A vast desert sky, painted in deep purples and streaks of gold. "How much for this one?" the woman asked. Sophie swallowed. 80. The woman exchanged a glance with her husband, who nodded. "We'll take it." For a moment, Sophie didn't move. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but now that it was happening, she felt frozen. Then, as the woman handed, maybe this time, maybe this person would stop, admire her work, and see her, not as a girl begging for charity, but as an artist. Most didn't. Some slowed their pace, their eyes flicking over the canvases before they walked on. Others barely noticed her at all. Then there were the ones who did stop, but only to offer pity, not support. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress sighed as she read Sophie's sign. "Oh, honey," she murmured, her voice thick with sympathy. "I wish I could help, but I just don't. Have the money?" Sophie smiled politely. "That's okay. Thank you for stopping." The woman lingered, her gaze heavy. "You poor thing, you must be so brave." Brave. That word again. She had heard it so many times since her diagnosis, but it never felt right. She wasn't brave. She was desperate. She was tired. Still, she nodded, letting the woman offer her soft words, then watched her walk away, just like the others. Not long after, a different kind of customer appeared. A man in a leather jacket, sunglasses perched on his head, sauntered up to her stand. He eyed the paintings for a moment, before letting out a low, amused scoff. "Nobody buys real art anymore." "Kid," he muttered, "you should try selling prints or, I don't know, TikTok commissions." Sophie's hands clenched into fists. She bit back the sharp response that was on the tip of her tongue, swallowing the anger that burned at the back of her throat. She had dealt with people like him before, people who didn't understand, who thought dreams weren't worth chasing. "I don't need your advice," she said simply. "I just need to fight." The man snorted but didn't argue. He walked away, blending back into the crowd. Sophie let out a slow breath. She refused to let frustration win. Because somewhere in this city, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, someone would see her, and that would change everything. By the 4th day, Sophie was exhausted. Her body ached from sitting on the hard metal stool. Her muscles felt weak from the chemo treatments. The summer heat pressed down on her skin, making her dizzy. She had sold 3 paintings in total. It wasn't enough. Not even close. She tried to stay optimistic, but the weight of reality was creeping in. Maybe the man in the leather jacket was right. Maybe no one cared. Then, out of nowhere, someone stopped. Not just any customer, but a journalist. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, carrying a notebook and a press badge clipped to her bag. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes lit up as she took in Sophie's stand. "This is beautiful," she said, gesturing toward a canvas of a twilight cityscape. "Did you paint all of these yourself?" Sophie blinked, nodding slowly. "Yeah." The journalist smiled, pulling out her phone. "I run a small online arts blog. I love finding hidden talent in the city. Mind if I take a few photos?" Sophie hesitated. "Wait, really?" For the next few minutes, the woman took pictures of the paintings, of Sophie sitting at her stand, of the small handwritten sign explaining why she was selling them. Then she asked the question Sophie wasn't expecting. "What's your story?" So Sophie told her. She talked about the hospital visits, the medical bills piling up, about how she refused to let her parents struggle alone. The journalist nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes in the corner of her notebook. "People should hear this," she said. "I'll make sure they do." Sophie didn't think much of it. People made promises all the time. But the next morning, when she arrived at her stand, something was different. More people were stopping, not just to look, but to buy. A woman bought 2 paintings in a row. A young couple flipped through her canvases, debating which one to take home. By noon, she had sold more paintings than she had in the last 4 days combined. Then her phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucas, her best friend. "Dude, check this out." She clicked the link. It was an article. Her article. Fighting for art, fighting for life. The teen who's painting her way to chemo. At the bottom, thousands of shares. Sophie's heart pounded. This was real, but even then, she didn't know just how big this moment was about to become. Her biggest customer yet, he was already on his way. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the sidewalk, stretching past Sophie's stand as another wave of pedestrians rushed by. The city was a blur of movement. People lost in their own worlds, their own problems, their own distractions. Sophie wiped the sweat from her forehead, trying to ignore the dizziness creeping in. Her body was screaming at her to rest, but rest wouldn't pay for chemo. She exhaled, adjusting the small stack of paintings on her table. The feature in the arts blog had helped. Sales were picking up, but she was still far from her goal. And then, without warning, the energy around her shifted. A quiet presence, a stillness that felt out of place amid the city's chaos. She felt it before she saw him. A tall, older man had stopped at her stand. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't glancing at his phone or rushing to his next meeting. He stood completely still, hands tucked into the pockets of a weathered leather jacket, a cowboy hat tilted low over his face. He was studying her paintings, not just looking, but really seeing. Sophie barely paid him any mind at first. She had seen all kinds of customers, curious tourists, skeptical businessmen, distracted shoppers who pretended to be interested, only to walk away. But this guy, something about him was different. She was too tired to figure out why. "See? Anything you like?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the long day. The man smirked, just a little, just enough for her to notice. "Depends," he said, his voice gravelly slow, unmistakably familiar. "What's the story behind these?" Sophie hesitated. Most people asked about the prices, not the story. She glanced at him again, properly this time. His face was lined with age, but his piercing blue eyes held something sharp, something steady, like they had seen 100 lifetimes and still weren't easily impressed. Something about him felt like an old Western come to life. She cleared her throat. "I paint because I have to," she said simply. "It's the only thing I can control right now." He didn't blink. He just waited, letting the silence do the work. So Sophie told him about the diagnosis, about the ticking clock the doctors had given her, about how every brushstroke, every sale, wasn't just about survival. It was about taking back her life. When she finished, the man didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded. Then he reached for a painting. He lifted a black and white canvas from the table, tilting it slightly in the light. It was one of Sophie's favorites, a vast desert landscape, the silhouette of a lone cowboy standing in the distance. The contrast between light and shadow, the endless sky above. It had taken her weeks to perfect. The man studied it carefully. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke. "I'll take this one." Sophie barely reacted at first. She had done this a dozen times before. Customers picking a piece, handing over cash, and walking away without a second thought. She swallowed, running a hand through the back of her short-cropped hair. The man didn't even reach for his wallet. Instead, he pulled out a checkbook. Sophie blinked, thrown off by the unexpected gesture. No one carried checkbooks anymore. She watched as he uncapped a pen, his movements slow and deliberate. He scribbled something down, tore the check from the book, and handed it to her. She took it hesitantly, her fingers barely gripping the paper. And then she saw the number. Her breath caught in her throat and her vision blurred at the edges as her eyes locked onto the check, onto the impossible amount written in neat, bold handwriting. Not $200, $50,000. Her hands started to shake. "This," she whispered, barely able to form words. "This can't be right." The man smirked, tilting his hat back slightly, finally revealing his face. Sophie's heart stopped. Clint Eastwood, the legend, the icon. The man whose films her dad had made her watch growing up. The man whose stare alone had defined generations of cinema. And here he was, standing in front of her, buying her art. No, changing her life. She couldn't breathe. She started, shaking her head in disbelief. I can't take this." Clint's eyes didn't waver. "It's not charity," he said. "It's a damn good painting." Sophie felt like the ground beneath her had disappeared. People were staring now. The few pedestrians nearby had taken notice, their whispers growing louder. Someone pulled out a phone, snapping a picture. But Sophie didn't care about the crowd. She looked at Clint, really looked at him, and saw something deeper in his expression. A quiet understanding. He knew what it meant to fight for something. He had spent his life doing it, and now in the middle of a busy street, he had just given her a chance to keep fighting too. Her hands clenched around the check. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. And the craziest part? This was only the beginning. Sophie's world tilted. She stared at the check in her trembling hands, her mind struggling to catch up with what she was seeing. Not $200, not $1,000, not $2,000, $50,000. Her breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the paper like it might slip away if she didn't hold on. The city noise faded, the rush of pedestrians, the distant honking of cars, the hum of street. Musicians. It all blurred into a dull, meaningless hum. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She forced herself to blink, to look again, convinced that she had read the number wrong. But there it was, clear as day, $50,000. Her stomach flipped, her pulse thundered in her ears. "This," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of it. "This must be a mistake." She looked up at the man, the cowboy in the leather jacket, the one who had spent the last few minutes casually flipping through her paintings like he had all the time in the world. And now, standing under the glare of the afternoon sun, she saw him for the first time, the sharp blue eyes, the familiar smirk. The quiet confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime unshaken by the world around him. Her breath caught. Clint Eastwood, the legend himself. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her father's favorite actor, the man whose movies had played in her living room every weekend growing up. The Hollywood icon who didn't just play tough guys on screen, he was one in real life. And now he was standing in front of her, handing her a check that could change everything. He watched her carefully, reading the shock on her face. Then he smirked again. "No mistake, kid," he said, his voice low and steady. "You just keep painting." Sophie swallowed hard. Her legs felt like they might give out. She opened her mouth, trying to form words. "Thank you. Why are you doing this? I don't deserve this." But nothing came out. Nothing in her life had ever prepared her for this moment, and it wasn't over yet. At first, no one noticed. The city moved on, as it always did, fast, distracted, unaware of the history unfolding right here on the sidewalk. Then the first whisper came. Someone, a teenage boy with earbuds jammed into his ears, stopped mid-step, his head tilting as he stared at Clint. His eyes widened. "Wait," he muttered, his voice uncertain but growing louder. "Is that Clint Eastwood?" A woman nearby turned her phone halfway raised. She squinted her gaze, searching.